Hi everyone, my name is Kristina Werner and I'm here to teach you all about watercolor envelopes and embellished lettering on watercolor paper for the Summer Creative Retreat. Thanks so much for joining me. I really got into mail art a couple of years ago. I've been doing it off and on for many, many years, but a couple of years ago in June 2019, I gave myself a challenge to create lots of envelopes. It was a passion project of mine. And throughout the last couple of years, I've done a lot of envelopes. And the thing that's really neat about it is I have put every single one of those into the mail and sent it off to the person whose name is on the front of it. I had a lot of great, amazing people that volunteered to let me use their addresses. So it was really fun knowing that I was creating these small pieces of art and just sending them off into the mail, and they were actually being received. I've learned over the years that the post office, especially if you are in the United States, it can really handle some really some really fancy envelopes. Don't be afraid to do some really fun things on your envelopes because the post office will deliver it. As long as you've got adequate postage, they will deliver your envelope. So throughout today's class, I'm going to be talking you through the creation of a watercolor envelope from beginning to end. We're going to start out talking about paper and making sure you have the right type of paper so you can fold it into an envelope. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of watercoloring, adding that lettering, embellishing, adding embellishments on top of the lettering. And then at the very end, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to protect your envelope when you put it into the mail so that if it comes across any moisture, giving it the best chance it has to arrive safely to the recipient. So I'm going to switch over to my overhead camera and let's get into it. Okay, we are starting with selecting watercolor paper. If you've ever tried to make a watercolor envelope, you might know that trying to fold some nice, thick, luscious watercolor paper doesn't usually go very well. The thicker the paper is, the harder it is to fold without cracking. So I like to use a 90-pound watercolor paper. This one is from Canson. It's from their foundation series, and it's a cold press 90-pound watercolor paper. I like the larger pads that are at least 11 by 15 because I like to make 5 by 7 envelopes. And in order to make a 5 by 7 envelope, you have to have nearly 10 by 10 inch squares of watercolor paper. So I like to get a little bit of a larger pad. So now we're going to go into the actual creating of the envelope. I like to use the We Are Memory Keepers 123 punch board. It folds out and has instructions on the inside flap. I'm going to zoom in here so you can see we're only interested in the envelope today, and our card size is 5 by 7, so our paper needs to be 9 7/8 inches square. And just remember that little punch guide number. We'll come back to that later. So the first thing we're going to do is cut our watercolor paper. This again is that 90-pound Canson watercolor paper, and I'm cutting it to 9 7/8 by 9 7/8, just as that guide told me to do on the inside of my punch board. So before we get to anything else, I want to point out that there is a bone folder on the punch board. So I'm going to pull that out and have that ready to go. And I'm going to go back and look at that guide on the envelope punch board. I want to take note of the punch guide measurement. So for a 5 by 7 envelope, the punch guide measurement is 4 1/8. I'm going to swing out the arm on my punch board. This is one of the reasons why I like the 123 punch board. A regular envelope punch board doesn't have that swing out arm. So I'm going to line up that left corner at 4 1/8. And then I'm going to take the bottom score line down on the arm, and I'm going to score going up at a diagonal up to the very top of my board. And before I turn my paper, I'm going to punch it. So I'll just rotate this to the left and slide that over and kind of feel for when my score line that I already have falls into the groove on the left-hand side. Then I'll punch and score once again. So I'm going to keep rotating. I'll rotate to the left once again, kind of feel for where that score line lines up with the groove on the left side of my board. and then I'll score up from the bottom once again, and then keep rotating. So for each side of the watercolor paper, you need to punch and then score from the bottom, from score line A. Now, if you ever forget any of these instructions, they are written on the inside of the punch board. So it's super easy to just refer back to that. I'll store my bone folder back inside and then fold up my punch board. So here's my envelope. It's all ready to go. I've got my 4 scored sides plus the edges punched out. So now we're going to prep our watercolor paper to actually do our painting. So I'm going to grab a hard board and we're going to tape it down to the board. Now you could always skip this part if you wanted to paint from edge to edge and paint all the flaps, but I like to just tape this down to a board so that it's a little bit easier to work with, and it also helps to prevent any warping. Now this paper, because it is not as thick and luxurious as some other watercolor papers, it can't handle as much water. And because of that, it does kind of warp a lot and have lots of hills and valleys. I've learned to just deal with it. But if you're only familiar with using thicker watercolor papers, you will notice a big difference using a thinner watercolor paper. However, it's much better than using regular cardstock. So I'm first going to use a wide watercolor brush just to wet the entire area of my envelope. I'm going to do a very simple painting technique for the background on my envelope. This is something I love to do on cards and also on envelopes. I'm going to grab a nice bright pink color from my watercolor palette. This is my palette filled with Magello Mission Gold watercolors. They're nice and bright and vibrant. So I'm going to bring this in and just start making kind of almost like little cloud shapes with the different colors of my paint. I'm going to grab a more red-orange shade. I'm going to bring this in. I'm going to sort of go in rainbow order on my envelope and overlap these colors a little bit, try to get them to mix as I add them to my watercolor paper. I'm adding a nice bright lemon yellow, and this yellow does tend to be overtaken by other colors very easily. So if you like a really bright yellow on your projects, you might want to put even more than you think down on your project, because that yellow will take on every color around it and it sort of gets lost. I'm going to add a very bright green, and once again I'm just going to add it to my envelope and sort of make a cloud shape. So the colors aren't mixing as much as they might on a regular watercolor paper. This is one of the cons of using a little bit of a thinner paper, but the fact that this paper will fold beautifully when it comes time for that is the trade-off. Or rather, the painting not behaving and mixing as much as it would on a regular paper is the trade-off for having the opportunity of folding the envelope. So I had a little bit of mud happening in that little spot, so I picked it up with my paper towel and then continued on. I'm adding some purple over on this one side, getting it sort of to mix a little bit. And then I'm going to grab a darker green, bring that up here at the top. And I have a lot of green in this upper right corner, but I'm kind of really okay with it because we're going to have our postage in that corner. So we're not going to be able to see as much of what's going on in that corner. I'm lifting up my board and getting those puddles of water to kind of move around a little bit. Using my paper towel to sop up those edges. I want to make sure I don't have huge puddles of color, but I am going to get some. And I want to keep the ones I have that are just a minimal amount. I'm going to bring in a little more water, kind of spread out this green color, get it to stretch all the way to the corner. And I'm also going to bring in a little bit of yellow, that same yellow, and I'm going to add it up to that top corner just to make sure I have color from edge to edge. Now, if you wanted to let this air dry, you definitely could. In fact, I really recommend that if you have the time. but I'm going to use a heat tool to speed along the drying process. Sometimes using a heat tool can be to your advantage. If you have colors that are mixing and they're almost mixing too much and you want to make sure they stop, you can use a heat tool to speed that along, or a hair dryer works as well. So after I had my initial layer of color, then I came back with those same colors and added additional kind of cloud shapes over the top. So this is really going to get some nice overlaps of all of those colors. They're not really mixing on the paper right now, especially because the paper was dry when I started painting the colors on top. But this is going to give me some really awesome watercolory hard edges. When I look at these watercolor backgrounds, I love kind of the soft and hard and the contrast between the two. This also gives me a chance to mix some colors with my brush and get some additional colors. So like that, the bottom, there's that darker green that's happening when I painted it over the blue and purple. I'm adding additional colors right on top, bringing that purple in, making sure I don't lose any of that intensity of color. As you might know, watercolor, when it dries, it does tend to fade back a little bit. So if you want a really bold, colorful background, you need to go even bolder than you want, so that when it dries, you have the nice saturation of color that you were looking for. Bringing in a little pink in this bottom corner just because I love that pink and I wanted a second instance of it. And then I'm going to bring in a little bit more of the green near the top. And I'm also going to grab some blue and bring that in up there, just so I have a little bit of a mix of color. So this is a really fun background to create. If you wanted to add some areas of black in there and then splatter white gouache or white acrylic paint on top, you could create an amazing galaxy background. It's a very similar technique. I share that technique on my YouTube channel quite a bit, and it's so fun to create that way. So I use my heat tool to speed along the drying process once again. And at this point, everything is dry. So I'm going to remove my blue painter's tape. And here's a little tip for you. If you have your watercolor paper that tears when you remove your tape, this usually helps me. I try to go pretty slow and I fold back that tape almost back on itself. You'll notice as I pull up this tape right here, I'm holding it fairly flat to the paper, and that helps prevent any tearing. It works really well for me. And we're going to move on to the lettering. I'm going to keep the lettering really, really simple for this envelope, but I'll give you some extra examples at the end of the video for some more elaborate embellishments. So I'm first placing my postage stamps on my envelope. I'm not adhering them or gluing them down right now. I just want to place them there so that I take that into consideration while I'm doing my lettering. I don't know how many times I've skipped that step and I do my lettering on the envelope and then I realize I have no postage stamps that aren't going to interfere with the lettering. It's really hard to find smaller ones sometimes. So I've penciled on my recipient's name. This is Lila Grace. And I'm going to be using a P.O. box address today. This is actually going to the daughter of one of my good friends. So I'm using a black paint just from that same paint palette. I've moved to a very small brush so that I can get a detailed lettering on this. And I'm going to do a mix of styles. I'm making her first name a very thick, bold capital letter. It's going to give me a very simple embellishment to go on top. And for her middle name, which is Grace, I'm actually going to switch to a more script style or a brush lettering style. Some of you might be familiar with that. I know a lot of you who are taking the classes in the summer creative retreat are lettering artists. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of lettering here. I'm painting on her middle name, Grace. And if you are not as comfortable just freehand drawing some letters, one thing you could do is you could use a light box You could even print out a font from a computer and trace it. You could trace it with a light box, or if you don't have a light box, you could take your project to a window with light outside and use that as your light box. So those are some other options that you could do. I decided to just freehand this and go for it. So I'm going to be using some metallic pearlescent paints from Yuli Watercolors today. I have this really beautiful gold shade. And when you're going to be embellishing on top of some letters, I really recommend using a pearlescent paint like this, or even gouache. You want something that's going to go over the top of your lettering. If you don't have anything like that, I would suggest making your initial lettering, in my case where it says Lila Grace, I would recommend using a very, very light color, maybe a pale blue, and then have your details on top. And then you can use a regular watercolor paint. So you can see this beautiful gold shimmer as it goes on. I'm going to keep the embellishment on this lettering very simple. I'm doing a monoline on each one of these letters, just right in the center of each block letter. I'm being super careful trying to get the same width on all of these, but of course, if it's not, that's totally okay. This is a very playful and fun envelope design. For the script lettering, I'm going to add my gold lines on the bold, thick downstrokes. Just going to add a little bit of shimmer onto that as well. And then I'm going to grab a very, very pale gray, very watered down black shade, and I'm going to be adding a little bit of a shadow onto all of this block lettering and also the script lettering. It's going to give it just a little bit of dimension. So I'm adding a little bit of that gray. And when you're watercoloring, sometimes the areas where your brush picks up wants to pool with color. So just be aware of that. You can pick it up with a thirsty brush, meaning you've dabbed off your watercolor brush on a paper towel so it's a little bit more dry. And then when you put your paint to that area, it will sop up the color from the surface of your watercolor paper. So I'm adding just a little bit of a shadow. It's very subtle, but I think it really sets off the entire area. So for her address, I'm going to be using a white gouache with a very, very small paintbrush. And this is a great time to talk to you about making sure your envelope arrives. I've discovered that as long as your address is very legible, it's not hidden, it's pretty obvious, it will arrive. And so I like to use block letters for the main street address. You can have a lot of fun with the person's name or maybe even the city and the state, but you want to make sure that the street and the house number or building number, as well as the postal code or zip code, are very, very obvious and legible. You don't want to hide those. There are some really fancy envelopes out there, and sometimes I've gotten away with something a little bit more elaborate, but I found that the most successful delivered envelopes are ones that have a very, very simple street address. So if you're new to mail art, I would recommend that you go that route. So after I had my address on there, I used my heat tool just to make sure everything was dry. And now we're going to get into the assembly of the envelope. We're going to put it all together. So you've got your 4 flaps. You're going to use a bone folder and fold up the flaps just to make sure they're all in the right spot. And as far as the way the We Are Memory Keepers envelope punch board or the 1-2-3 punch board, the way they make the envelopes is you're going to have that bottom flap that overlaps the side flaps. So when you add adhesive to the bottom flap, this is what I do. I use a tape adhesive. This is score tape. I believe it's 1/8 inch score tape. And I don't take it all the way to the point of that flap. I leave maybe about 1.5 inches left before the point. And that's just going to make sure that it doesn't have any adhesive that goes onto the inside of the envelope. And that'll make more sense when you see me fold up the flap right here.
If you don't have a good adhesive like this, you might even use a liquid adhesive as well. It would double up. So I'm going to fold this up. You see how that flap goes above the two side flaps? That's why I didn't take the adhesive all the way to the point. All right, so we've assembled our envelope. Now we're going to get our postage on there. So I've put a bunch of water on this paper towel and I'm pressing my vintage stamp onto it. I had some black watercolor on my fingertips and then pressing that down onto my envelope. This is how I like to adhere vintage stamps that have that moisture adhesive or the adhesive that needs moisture because I don't want to lick the back. This one is a forever stamp, so it's like a sticker. It's going to go right on top. And then for this other vintage stamp right here, I'm going to press it down onto that wet paper towel once again. You could also use a water brush or something like that to add adhesive on the back. And I'm using a bunch of postage. I don't think I actually need all of the postage on this envelope for this, but I go for the aesthetics. So we're going to protect the envelope now. This is what I prefer to use. It's called Distress Microglaze. It comes in a little jar like this, and it's kind of the consistency of lip balm. What this product does is it puts a film over your project, and it makes it resistant to water. It's not going to be waterproof, but it is going to resist water quite a bit. So as I'm applying this, I'm going to rub it onto the envelope. Now I'm using a mini round blending tool for this, but you could also use your fingertips. I just happen to have a blending tool like this because I'm a card maker and I do a lot of ink blending. So I'm dipping into that jar and I'm swirling the microglaze over the top of my project. You'll notice that it does not move any of the paint. It's sort of a miracle product like that. It doesn't disturb anything underneath, but because it is going to make it water resistant and kind of seal it, I'm making sure that I do not go over my postage stamps. If you were to go over the postage stamps, you would have problems, or rather the post office would have problems canceling out those stamps. So just be advised, just skip that top right corner. So after I've applied the microglaze, there's one last step. I'm going to take the paper towel that I put down underneath it, and I'm going to ball it up and just buff that in. So the microglaze is on the surface of the paper right now, and over the next few hours, it's going to dry and absorb into the paper. So right now, it has a little bit of kind of a shiny sheen to the surface of the envelope. It feels a little bit tacky because it's not completely dry, but that will dry over time and then you won't really see any of that sealant over the top. So that's a great way to protect your envelope. All right, here's a different option if you don't have a microglaze. I have found these amazing clear sleeves online. It's actually meant for a 5x7 photo, but you can put a 5x7 envelope inside. So this is what I do for envelopes that go a little bit crazy and I'm not sure if they're going to be able to be delivered. Or if it's a holographic envelope, or anytime I have a little bit of doubt about it actually being delivered, I'll put it in a clear sleeve after I have my card inside, obviously. And then I will take a return address label, or it could be any label, whatever size you have, and I write the address on it again. And then I'll put it on the outside of this clear sleeve. Now, I'm going to pause this really quick here and just advise you that when you do use a plastic sleeve like this, you need to have the postage on the outside. So if I was to send it like this, it would not be good news. The post office would not like me if I sent it like this. So I'm going to be mailing it without the plastic sleeve. That's why I put the postage directly on the envelope. But if you were going to send your envelope in a plastic sleeve, please, please, please make sure your postage is on the outside. So here are some extra ideas for embellishing some block letters and also some script letters. I just drawn these letters out on some watercolor paper. And now I'm using some colorful paints from that same palette that I was using earlier. And I'm just doing a little bit of embellishment. For this first one, I've drawn some vines around the letter B and added some leaves. I'll come back later and add some little dots that look like flowers, but for now I just have a really fun kind of vine shape happening. For my letter A, I'm going to take a bright pink, kind of a magenta shade, and I'm going to paint the interior of my letter. So it's going to have a black outline, and I'll come back and add some more detail on the inside of this in a bit, but for now I'm going to let that dry. For the C, I used that same gold paint that I used earlier, and I just did some diagonal stripes. This one's super easy and simple, but it does have a lot of impact. And for my block letter D, I'm going to take a blue shade, fill the bottom half, and then I'm coming in with a teal shade and filling in the top. I like splitting letters like this, having different colors. You could even have multiple colors across all of the letters in your recipient's name. So I'm just showing those same ideas, but on the scripted letters. For really kind of over-the-top embellishments like this vine, I would recommend only doing it on one letter or a few letters, just to keep it a little bit more simple. But because it does really pack a punch, that's what I would do here. So I'm going to bring in some pink dots for some little flowers on this one. I think that looks really, really pretty. So I've done some gold diagonal stripes, and I also put the other designs on here. To finish off the A and also this lowercase c at the bottom, just put a little bit of silver right in the center. Kept it simple. And for the two color letter, for that D and also this B, I'm just adding some dots at the bottom. Sort of makes me think you could turn it into a Mickey Mouse type thing if you did red and yellow. All right, so here are all of the different styles that I wanted to show you, kind of extras to this class. And I hope you enjoyed today's envelope.
I hope you guys enjoyed that envelope. It was so much fun to put together. I can't wait to see what you guys create. If you're looking for more inspiration for mail art and lettering, you can check out my YouTube channel. I have that listed on screen. Or if you have questions about this class today, you can catch me at Instagram. My Instagram name is Star of May. I love stars and I was born in May, so it's the perfect name for me. Send me a direct message over there. Let me know if you've created an envelope of your own. Send me a photo. I want to see what you've created. Thank you so much for watching today, and I can't wait to see what you guys create.